Welcome, everyone. If I still got sound? You hear me? Good afternoon, y'all, I should say then. Thanks for coming. I think everybody knows who I am. I know most of y'all. I originally gave this presentation back in October for the Coastal Georgia Historical Society, but that was right during the rash of storm du jour we seem to be having about every week, and some folks got a little confused as to when the programs were going to be, so some folks couldn't make it, and the Brotherhood asked me to do it here again for those folks that couldn't make it. So I chose this title because the Golden Isles is not only famous for its beautiful marshes of Glen and its beautiful resort islands and golf courses, it also happens to be the home to approximately 200 churches in the area. And so it comes as a surprise to quite a number, please come on in. It comes as a surprise to a lot of folks to find out that there's also a synagogue nestled quietly within all the many crosses and steeples that grace our fair city here. Even some local folks who grow up here say, a synagogue in Brunswick? Where? Who knew? So this afternoon, I'd like to tell you all a story about how Brunswick's historic synagogue came to be here, the story of the Southern Jews who built it, and their part in helping to build the post-Civil War city of Brunswick that we know today. And then, I'd like to share with you all a real, true-life mystery. I'd like to start with this image of the Statue of Liberty in Ellis Island, the famous immigration station in New York Harbor. I like to start there because, contrary to popular belief, even in many Jewish Sunday schools today, the American Jewish immigration story does not begin here. It actually begins about 200 years earlier, when a small ship carrying 23 Jews arrived unexpectedly in the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam in 1654. They were fleeing the Spanish Inquisition and forced Christian conversion imposed on them by the Portuguese following their recent conquest of Brazil. And as you might imagine, at a time when our history, when the commonly accepted Christian theology of today was openly portraying Jews as Christ-rejecting villains or even worse. So these unexpected Jewish arrivals were just really not welcomed very much. As a matter of fact, Peter Stuyvesant actively petitioned the Dutch government to ban all Jews permanently from his colony. Meanwhile, as religious wars between Catholics and Protestants raged on spasmodically in Europe, former safe havens for Jews were often the targets of religious zealots on both sides of that argument. So, with reliable safe havens for Jews dwindling in Europe, they began showing up here in larger numbers on America's shores. Now, initially, most of the Dutch, English, French, Spanish colonies of the New World, they adopted policies pretty much consistent with the attitudes of their founders. Basically, Protestants banned Catholics, Catholics banned Protestants, and they all banned the Jews. In those early days of colonial America, freedom from religion was oftentimes more important than freedom of religion. However, to be fair, life in colonial America was far from easy. While religious loyalties did run deep, the day-to-day struggle for life in the colonies was a constant struggle, and also for security reasons was a cooperative effort. So it may be that though Jews were generally not welcome in any parts of the New World, there simply wasn't enough time, idle time anyway, left in the colonies for the types of organized persecution like you saw in Europe at the time. Plus, above all, to survive, a colony needs people. Official bans of some of the newcomers were therefore possibly just quietly ignored. No one was more aware of needing more colonists than the pragmatic and politically savvy General James Oglethorpe, as he struggled to keep the new fledgling colony of Georgia alive in 1733. His colony was in danger of failing. An epidemic was raging, and the colony's only doctor had died a few months earlier. So in July of that year, when a boatload of 42 Jews arrived unexpectedly at the docks in Savannah, Georgia's founder took a slightly different tack than some of the earlier colonial leaders. Following some very tough negotiations with an infectious disease specialist named Dr. Samuel Nunez Ribeiro, who just happened to be one of the Jews on board the ship, and I might add also over the loud objections of Oglethorpe's charter members. General Oglethorpe not only allowed the Jewish immigrants to stay, but because Dr. Ribeiro's medical skills likely saved the new colony from certain collapse. For that reason, the Jewish arrivals were provided full colonial rights. Those rights included owning land, bearing arms, serving in the militia, and eventually holding official positions of trust within the authority and within the colony. But now, although the new colony of Georgia did reluctantly admit the Jews, their charter still did not allow Catholics, or whiskey, or slaves, or lawyers of any faith. Brunswick's Jewish community, however, was not an outgrowth of these original 42 Jewish immigrants. Many of the original Savannah Jews, fearing a likely invasion from Spanish Florida in 1741, actually fled to Charleston or the safety of more northern cities such as Philadelphia or New York. And while most of Savannah's original Jewish community were Sephardic Jews, Brunswick's Jewish community were largely Ashkenazi or European Jews. I need to pause here and explain a little bit that because of the many forced exiles of the diaspora, Jews were dispersed from the Holy Land to many different parts of the Old World. Many Jews immigrated north into Christian-dominated Central Europe. They became known as Ashkenazi Jews. Others immigrated west into Muslim-controlled North Africa and Spanish Iberian Peninsula, and they became known as Sephardic or Spanish Jews. Over time, significant differences in customs, languages, and religious liturgy developed that distinguished the European Ashkenazi Jew from the Spanish Sephardic Jew. These differences are significant enough today that Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews are considered two different branches of Judaism. Historically, most of the 17th and 18th century Jewish immigrants to the Americas were Sephardic Jews, fleeing the Inquisition, while most of the 19th century Jewish immigrants were from European Ashkenazi Jewish areas because they were fleeing both Catholic and Protestant persecution. So at least, at the beginning, Spanish Jews, Savannah's Jews, and Brunswick's Jews were initially from two different branches of Judaism. Also, Brunswick's Jewish community were predominantly members of a 19th century Enlightenment-era Jewish faith movement known as German Reform, which was liturgically more modern and very different from the older traditional Orthodox Judaism. So, where did Brunswick's Jews come from? Well, census records from the 1950s and 60s do reveal a few Jewish names here in Brunswick, a Gustavus Friedlander and a Jacob Lisner, for instance. And there were a few sketchy records of two Jewish merchants, Cohen and Lisner, who were donating materials to the Brunswick ladies to sew uniforms and blankets for Confederate soldiers during the Civil War. Brunswick's Jewish community of the day really has its roots in the turbulent Civil War and post-Civil War period of the 1860s and 1870s. During that period, large groups of European Jews were being forced out of Europe by Prussian ethnic cleansing decrees and continued Russian pogroms. Most of these displaced Jews fleeing Europe probably entered the U.S. through the Castle Garden immigration depot located in the eastern tip of Manhattan. And though many of these new immigrants did settle in the new ghettos being formed in New York, there was at the very same time an urgent need to rebuild the South's ruined economy following the devastation of the Civil War. So many of these displaced Jewish merchants sought opportunity and a new life in the war-torn towns of the Deep South. Not just Brunswick, but if you go through any of the local towns down in the Deep South, Jewish storefronts are pretty common all over. And so it was here, in the once nearly abandoned city of Brunswick, that the history of Temple Beth Tefillah and its congregation really begins. But it's not just the history of the building of a historic synagogue in the Deep South. It's also the story of a small group of Jewish migrants who, though struggling to survive in this strange new world, still stubbornly clung to their ancient faith and coalesced into the vibrant community that became Congregation Brunswick Beth Tefillah. Throughout the late 1800s, Brunswick's small group of Jewish residents held religious services in private homes and rented social halls. They occasionally borrowed a synagogue from Mikveh Israel in Savannah if they could for special services. Then, on December 16th, 1886, Brunswick resident David Glauber proffered a resolution to 21 other Jewish residents in the city. It read in part, "Imbued with a like spirit, a number of Israelites of this city of Brunswick have taken the initiatory step to form a Hebrew congregation and to devise ways and means to erect a house to the Lord, to the glory of Him and to the well-being of mankind." Now, if you've ever been in a Jewish meeting, you know Jews rarely agree on anything unanimously. So we really don't know what the outcome of that vote was. But nevertheless, we do know that it was approved and Congregation Beth Tefillah was born. Just a few months earlier, President Grover Cleveland had dedicated the Statue of Liberty. Also about the same time, a pharmacist in Atlanta, trying to develop a cure for morphine addiction, created a rather weird concoction, later was popular in soda fountains, that he called Coca-Cola. And about the same time, very close by here, a group of northern millionaires were forming a very exclusive hunting club on nearby Jekyll Island. It took the founding temple members about a year to get things rolling. But once they did, things moved rather quickly. In 1888, they elected officers, organized themselves into working committees, and set about hiring a rabbi, enlarging the congregation, and more importantly, raising funds to build a synagogue. On September 14th, 1888, they filed a petition with the state of Georgia for incorporation. On November 18th, they purchased a 90 by 120-foot lot on the corner of Egmont and Monk Streets for $2,500. They purchased it from the Brunswick's Mason Ocean Lodge number 214. On May 30th, they broke ground. In July, they ordered bricks, stone, and marble. And in August, they signed a contract with J.O. Smith of Savannah to build a $10,000 brick synagogue, and the work started in earnest. Then, on November 12th, 1889, the city of Brunswick held a huge parade to celebrate the laying of the cornerstone of the new synagogue. Now, this is no small event. This parade was led by the Knights of Pythias and a contingent of the Brunswick Rifles. Carriages filled with dignitaries proceeded up from Monk Street in the old City Hall, up Monk Street on Newcastle, across Egmont Street to the corner of Norwich, right over here, where they all assembled for congratulatory speeches and the depositing of numerous special items in the cornerstone to commemorate the event. Among the items they put in this cornerstone was a photograph of the synagogue's first rabbi, a history of the congregation, the constitution and bylaws of the synagogue, a history of St. Simon's and Cumberland Islands written by one of the temple members, a Brunswick advertising pamphlet entitled "The City by the Sea." There were copies of old newspapers of the day, lots of old coins, plus some Confederate money. And last but not least, there was a certificate of the laying of the very first brick of the synagogue by Master Harold Michelson, aged 2 years and 10 months. He lived, by the way, just across the street where the new house is being renovated. The cornerstone was then sealed. You'll note there was a couple of curious markings on the cornerstone. On one side of the cornerstone is the number 5650. The number 5650 is a Jewish calendar date. The Jewish calendar year of 5650 is the same year as the modern Gregorian calendar year of 1889. The other side bears an inscription laid by MWGM Davidson. One person told me they thought MWGM was a very large Roman numeral number. Actually, it's the initials of Freemasonry title for honor. It stands for Most Worshipful Grandmaster J.S. Davidson. Followed by the date, November 12th, 5889. Well, that's a mischisel. There's no other word for it. It should read November 12th, 1889. November 12th, 5889 of the Jewish calendar would still be about 100 years from now in the year 2129. So we're pretty sure it's a mistake. Finally, 1 week short of a year, November 7th, 1890, all the hard work finally paid off, and Brunswick's Jewish community officially dedicated their Beit Tefillah, or house of prayer. The little temple's dramatic onion dome and unique keyhole windows actually harken back to a synagogue style from a much, much earlier time. It's a Moorish revival-style synagogue, popular with Reformed Jews in both Europe and America in the middle and later parts of the 19th century. However, many early synagogues in America, they've been replaced with very different or more modern structures, leaving Temple Beth Tefillah standing nearly alone today as a rare architectural jewel of early American history. So rare, in fact, that current research indicates that Brunswick's Temple Beth Tefillah is probably among the top 10 oldest synagogues in America still holding services in its original structure. Designed by renowned Jewish architect Alfred Eichberg, Temple Beth Tefillah is one of only two that I know of he designed, and the only one still standing. Though mainly known for his Savannah buildings, Eichberg is well known to us here in Brunswick as the designer of many of the city's historic buildings. The old City Hall, for instance. For those who went to Glen Academy's annex, designed by him. Columbia Downing's Manor House is an Eichberg design. And the old National Bank of Brunswick was an Eichberg design, but that building was pretty much covered over by the Cresses store when they opened in 1912. Alfred Eichberg had offices here in Brunswick on Newcastle Street in the 1890s, and he was part owner of Brunswick's short-lived ice plant and brewery, which he and Max Ullman were partners in. And though synagogue membership records are missing for that period of time, it's very likely that he not only attended Beth Tefillah, but it's also quite possibly he may have been a member here also. We just don't know. The official dedication of Temple Beth Tefillah took place on November 7th, 1890. Everyone in Brunswick who was anyone, and even from the surrounding area, they were all here. The guests of honor were the popular and well-known Georgia Senator Charles Wesolowski from Albany and Rabbi Isaac Mayer Weiss of Cincinnati. While the gregarious and popular Senator Wesolowski was well known and beloved by Georgia's Jewish community, Isaac Mayer Weiss was well known to virtually all American Jews. As one of the founders of American Reform Judaism, Isaac Mayer Weiss is considered by many to be one of the most important American rabbis of the 19th century. He intervened on behalf of American Jews on at least 2 occasions in the Civil War. In December of 1862, General Grant issued his infamous General Order Number 11, expelling all Jews from his military district of Tennessee, Mississippi, and Kentucky. Rabbi Weiss called it an outrage without precedent in American history and was instrumental in getting President Abraham Lincoln to overturn that infamous order. It's also been suggested that Rabbi Weiss, working with other rabbis in Washington, was also instrumental in getting President Lincoln to change a rather silly law, an 1881 law requiring all Union Army chaplains to be ordained in the Christian faith. We had a couple of completely Jewish regimental units in Pennsylvania that for a while was really kind of comical, but they did change that law also. Later, Rabbi Weiss established the Union of American Hebrew Congregations in 1873, the Hebrew Union College in 1875, and the Central Conference of American Rabbis in 1889. And then, at age 70, one of the most influential rabbis of the 19th century made an arduous 2-day train trip from Cincinnati to the little city by the sea to help dedicate its brand new synagogue. Rabbi Weiss later wrote an account of the dedication in his newspaper, The American Israelite. He wrote, "Shortly after 5 p.m., the procession headed by Rabbi Rubino, followed by the bearers of the scroll of the law, 2 rabbis, Farber of Macon and Weiss of Cincinnati, the officers of the congregation, and the Honorable Senator Wesolowski, slowly entered the sanctuary, while the choir, accompanied by the temple's new melodeon, sang a special processional hymn." Wouldn't you love to know where that is now? 2 young ladies then decorated the scrolls of the Torah with wreaths of garlands of flowers corresponding with the rich flowers and evergreen decorations that were already in the sanctuary. Then a young lady, flanked by 2 smaller children, presented the president of the congregation, Mr. Ullman, with the keys to the sanctuary. Following an acceptance speech by the president and the lighting of the synagogue's eternal flame, I love this, the 2-hour service continued with hymns, prayers, sermons by Rabbis Rubino and Weiss, and finally, a Torah reading. Then, with the synagogue service over, the approximately 150 members and invited guests moved the celebration to the Oglethorpe Hotel, where food, drink, and multiple rounds of toasts continued well into the evening. Isaac Mayer Weiss' toasts were especially interesting. After praising the floridly poetic diction and vehemently delivery of the Southern speakers, compared to, as he put it, the cool, prosaic men of the North, Rabbi Weiss made several observations about Brunswick and its citizens. He said that love thy city, or love thy neighbor as thyself, seemed to be on full display here in Brunswick. He referred to Brunswick as a cosmopolitan city, in, as he put it, the noblest sense of the term. He particularly made note of a number of Israelites holding positions of authority and responsibility here in the city. The president of the Board of Education was David Glauber. The president of the Board of Aldermen was Max Ullman. The chief of the Fire Commission was Robert Levinson. The city recorder was Sam Borchardt. The president of the Board of Trade was Benjamin Hirsch. Actually, nearly a third of the Board of Trade members were all members of Temple Beth Tefillah. So, with the party over, let's go inside and see what these early temple members built. As we go up the stairs, notice the historic plaque issued by the U.S. Department of the Interior designating this synagogue as being on the National Registry of Historic Places. Also notice that in keeping with the biblical commandment, and you shall inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates, Temple Beth Tefillah's mezuzah, containing specific verses from the book of Deuteronomy, is mounted on our doorpost. We're not sure when or how, but the original mezuzah went missing some time ago. As we open the main doors and enter the sanctuary, the dramatic Moorish revival style of the exterior shifts to a really stunningly beautiful Gothic interior. You can look around here and see the same thing if you like. Unlike many other synagogues in America that began life as a traditional Orthodox synagogue, Brunswick's Temple Beth Tefillah was never an Orthodox synagogue. As mentioned earlier, it's always, from its inception, been a Reformed temple. As a result, while Brunswick's Temple Beth Tefillah is very definitely a Jewish house of worship, its interior is different in many respects from a traditional Orthodox synagogue. For instance, in a traditional European Orthodox synagogue of the same time, the bema, or pulpit here, would usually be in the center of the sanctuary rather than at the far end. Also, this view is from the mezzanine balcony. In an Orthodox synagogue, there'd be a screen up there for the women and children to sit behind and they wouldn't be allowed to take part in the service or even be in this main part of the sanctuary. As a Reformed synagogue, women and children have always been seated with the men at Temple Beth Tefillah services. Unfortunately, many of Temple Beth Tefillah's original stained glass windows were probably broken or severely damaged by hurricanes of 1893, 1896, and 1898. You thought this was a rough year. Both the 1893 Sea Island hurricane and the 1896 Cedar Key hurricanes clocked sustained winds of around 120 miles an hour. Though the 1893 hurricane actually came ashore in Brunswick closer than the 1896 Cedar Key hurricane, the Cedar Key hurricane was more destructive. That was a backdoor hurricane. And like Hurricane Helene that happened just a few months ago, as we recently found out, the rotational pattern of backdoor hurricanes that come in from the south or the west produce stronger than winds from a similar Atlantic hurricane. The 1896 storm downed so many trees that it severely damaged the turpentine market in all of southeast Georgia that was critical to Brunswick's economy. So, Brunswick was just recovering from the previous storms when the great Georgia hurricane of 1898 slammed into the coastal Georgia just south of Cumberland Island with an estimated 16-foot storm surge and Category 4 storm surge winds of over 130 miles an hour. There are no records of the damage done to Temple Beth Tefillah, but both Francis Xavier Catholic Church and St. Mark's Episcopal Church recorded extensive structural damage. In one Francis Xavier account, I think they even referred to the flood as a tsunami. If you were at the earlier lecture, Buddy Sullivan mentioned in his talk in October that the pictures I borrowed from him here of the flood, well known in downtown Brunswick, but what people don't realize is that those photographs were taken well after the water started receding. So it was substantially deeper than that. Though the records are missing, we know the damage to Temple Beth Tefillah must have been substantial because newspapers ran ads for repair the synagogue, ran fundraising ads to repair the synagogue, and one also ran an ad to reopen the synagogue. So apparently the damage to the temple was extensive enough to actually make it unusable for a while. Funds were raised, the damage was repaired, but signs of these hurricanes have remained with us through the years, even today. The few original windows that are left almost all show signs of damage. These are the oldest windows in the synagogue. These are the two little ones up here. They're relatively undamaged because they were on the eastern wall, but the other ones on the, these were on the western wall. On the eastern wall were all the yellow pieces of these. All of those have cracked in them. And so every piece of yellow glass in here that you see, including this one here, was just a hastily repaired, done to it to make the synagogue usable again. According to one expert, though, the glass in these original windows may have actually been imported from Europe. And the experts who worked on it were at least certainly trained by the European style of putting it in. But let's go back to the sanctuary for a moment. The beautiful stained glass windows on the temple's northern and southern walls were probably replaced sometime around 1900. We don't have any record of what the original ones look like, but from the similarity of the pattern of some of the original windows, the replacements were quite possibly similar. According to Rabbi Saul Rubin, a Rabbi Emeritus of Temple Beth Tefillah here, though the interior of this sanctuary is basic Gothic in its structure, it's still filled with subtle Jewish symbolism in the form of significant patterns, colors, and groupings in the windows, and these windows are a good example. I was just counting to make sure I was right. There are 12 windows on each wall of the original, that relating to the original 12 Hebrew tribes, organized into groups of 3. Like Christianity, the number 3 is an important symbol both in Christianity and in Judaism. It can stand for the 3 major groupings of the Jewish people following their exodus from Egypt, or it can stand for the giving of the Torah on the 3rd month following the exile from Egypt. Others traditionally look at it as the 3 symbols standing for God, Torah, and Israel. The bright colored yellow represents the glory of God, the red for life and vitality, while the blue outlines the blue threads found on the ends of Jewish prayer shawls. The 8-pointed stars can be interpreted as variations of the mystical seals of Solomon. It also represents the first day God ruled over the world, following a day of rest. There are many more symbols and interpretations, but one question always comes up: where are the stars of David? Well, one main reason why may be that while the Star of David, in this particular form here, is a very, very old Jewish symbol, Brunswick, Georgia's historic synagogue is at least 2 years older than the popular blue and white Star of David seen here. This is generally accepted symbols of universal Judaism today. The beautiful 10 Commandments window. That's a more recent addition. That was probably put in here, we think, sometime around 1970. We're estimating that, and we're hoping some people can verify that for us, because it was dedicated to a lady who happened to be at my wedding, Sadie Bluestein. And so the Bluestein family actually dedicated that window. And so knowing when I was married and knowing when the window was, we're pretty sure it's around 1970. Now, it does have some stylized 6-pointed stars in it, if you look carefully at it. And there's a couple of what may be corn stalks, or quite possibly pomegranates. If they're pomegranates, that's kind of interesting, because if you happen to be sitting around the house one day and you happen to have a pomegranate, cut it open and count the seeds. You'll find out there are 613 seeds in a pomegranate, and it happens to be the precise number of laws and commandments that you find in the Torah. I haven't counted them personally, but if you've got nothing to do one afternoon, call me up and let me know. That brings me to the ark. For those of you who are not familiar with our sanctuary, the ark holds our Torah scrolls. And as most of you know, I'm sure, the Torah is a sacred religious scroll that contains the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Torahs can't be printed, they can't be Xeroxed or copied or marked in any way. The writing in a Torah scroll is carefully inked onto animal parchment by specially trained scribes using a quill pen 1 letter at a time. Each of the over 300,000 letters and nearly 80,000 words of a Torah are precisely laid out in specifically prescribed columns and rows. And while there are some slight variations of fonts, as well as different animals used for the parchment, and different woods for the spindle that help us identify age and origin of a scroll, all Torah scrolls are identical in content. Some synagogues in rural areas, as I mentioned earlier, don't have any Torah scrolls, and they have to borrow them from larger synagogues for special services like the High Holy Days. Most small synagogues like ours, if they're very, very lucky, they have at least 1 Torah. And that brings me to the real mystery that I mentioned, that I wanted to, at the very beginning of my talk. Temple Beth Tefillah has not just 1 Torah scroll. Temple Beth Tefillah has 5 Torah scrolls. And the mystery is, we don't have a clue as to why or how we got them. Now, all Torahs are religiously sacred and special, but these particular scrolls are also historically extremely important. For instance, scribes tell us that one of these scrolls from Central Europe is actually older than the state of Georgia. Another one was carefully pieced together from several other presumably damaged scrolls. There must be an incredible story associated with that, but we don't know. Also, even though, as I mentioned earlier, Temple Beth Tefillah's congregations are historically Ashkenazi Jews, one scribe told us that one of these scrolls is actually a Sephardic scroll. And finally, To add to the mystery, 2 of these 5 Torah scrolls, as you can see there, are very small. Compared to the regular-sized Torah, they're actually quite tiny. According to a scribe who examined them, these tiny Torahs are pogrom scrolls, as perfect and complete as a normal-sized Torah, but intentionally so small that they could be hidden and easily smuggled around. They were possibly sneaked out of Russia sometime in the early 1800s. How these 2 tiny precious relics from a distant troubled past ended up here at Temple Beth Tefillah is anyone's guess. All of these scrolls are now carefully protected and safe from whatever threat triggered their original exodus from Europe. Hopefully, one day, the story of how these historic Torahs, originally from as far away as Germany, Hungary, and Russia, somehow crossed the Atlantic and found a home here in Temple Beth Tefillah will be discovered. It's a true life mystery worth solving, because these fragile documents are actually living symbols of the Jewish will to survive all adversity. As you might have figured out by now, through the years, many of Temple Beth Tefillah's original records have been lost or misplaced. Those of us interested in the Historic Preservation Committee were actively scouring the community trying to locate many of these lost records, so any information you might have or any assistance you can provide would be greatly, greatly appreciated. At this point, I'd like to offer some observations on not just the contribution of Brunswick's Jewish community made in helping to shape the city, but also in the city's relationship to its Jewish community. Isaac Mayer Weiss was correct about the cosmopolitan nature of this little city by the sea. As a matter of fact, had Rabbi Weiss been able to look into the future, he would have reported that the cosmopolitan nature of our fair city was not a short-lived phenomenon. It continued through the years. As the city grew, Brunswick's Jewish community became fully integrated into the larger community, representing a significant cross-section of Glenn County's municipal, commercial, and professional businesses. During World War I, Temple members joined the local community in providing significant material support in support of our American troops overseas. What records we do have at the time indicate that Temple Beth Tefillah made a special pledge to the local Red Cross to, quote, assist in any way bodily and financially. The Temple Sisterhood joined the ladies of our other local churches in making hundreds, if not thousands, of bandages and first aid wrappings for the wounded soldiers. And Temple Beth Tefillah then sold an excess portion of its original 90 by 120-foot property to the County Board of Education that it then used to build the new Glenn Academy building dedicated to the local citizens who gave their life in that great war. During World War II, the patriotic support was easily as much, if not even greater. The Temple Sisterhood joined other organizations in providing hostesses for the local USO. They organized a string of social affairs for the servicemen, and including holding a large, probably a Purim ball, a costume ball at one of the USOs here. Like almost everyone else in Brunswick, Temple members overwhelmingly supported Brunswick's ambitious Liberty Ship program. In December of 1943, Temple member and shipyard management employee Fred Pfeiffer received a telegram from J.A. Jones himself, congratulating Mr. Pfeiffer on the Brunswick shipyard receiving both the prestigious Maritime M. Pennant and the Victory Fleet Flag from the U.S. Maritime Commission for outstanding production and achievement in ship construction. Very few plants got that, by the way. Following the war, as the downtown area of Brunswick entered into a less frenetic post-war period of the 1950s, Jewish storefronts like Altman's, Schreiber's, Gordon's, Friedman's, Zell's, Salkin's, Eisenberg, Sadie's Specialty Shop, and of course the Lollipop made up a substantial portion of downtown Brunswick in the 1950s. They were all members of Temple Beth Tefillah. A few years earlier, you would also have seen names like Rothschild, Cohen, Hirsch, Lisner, Levinson, and Ullman. It's not part of the normal talk here, but if you actually look at that tree, If you ever heard the song, Tie a Yellow Ribbon Round the Old Oak Tree, well, the Greyhound bus station used to be right here where Rothschild is, and the legend is that that's the tree that song was written about. I wasn't here in the 60s, but I'm told that during that period, the head of the Elks Club, the Rotary Club, the Kiwanis Club, Brunswick's Women's Club, and the Association of University Women were all also members of Brunswick's Temple Beth Tefillah. Finally, you hear a lot about intolerance today. So it's worth noting that throughout all of these years, from 1890 through today, the gleaming white walls of Temple Beth Tefillah's historic little synagogue have seen only one instance of anti-Semitism. That was in 2008, when someone scribbled some ugly graffiti on an outside wall of the temple. As I understand the story, some of the nearby Glen Academy staff were so upset that they cleaned the offensive graffiti off the wall before the rabbi and most of the congregation ever even saw it. I can't end the discussion of Brunswick community here without addressing one of the more curious place names found on Glen Academy's maps. I'm referring, of course, to Jewtown. As my grandkids would say, what's up with that? Well, the name has an interesting and historic origin and also relates to the history of Temple Beth Tefillah and Brunswick's Jewish community. First, though, regardless of the term and how it's used today or its general interpretation, Jewtown on St. Simon's is not now and never was intended to be a pejorative term. The term came into being in the 1920s when two Temple Beth Tefillah members, Robert and Sig Levinson, opened a general store on the island to support the workers at the nearby lumber mill. The store was very popular with the island's recently emancipated African Americans. As such, a small African American community grew up around the Levinson store. The Levinson called the area Levinsontown. It's even hard to say, or Levinsonton. The name didn't stick. One reason, anecdotally suggested, is that many of the former enslaved families living around the area still spoke a local dialect of the Gullah Geechee language and actually had trouble pronouncing Levinsonton, just like I did. So they just named it Jewtown, and that name did stick. Today, though, it's no longer a predominantly African-American community. Jewtown, along with Harrington and South End, is one of three important historic African-American communities on St. Simon's Island. Far from being a pejorative term, Jewtown is another good example of how the various ethnic communities in this area found ways to work together to form a better community. So in conclusion, David Glauber and the 22 extraordinary gentlemen who melded Brunswick's Jewish community into a cohesive congregation, I think they took special care to also effectively weave the thread of Brunswick's small Jewish community into the larger fabric of helping to create a lasting image of shared cooperation and tolerance for the many religious and ethnic groups in Brunswick and the Golden Isles today. Thank you. We got a little time for some questions if we have any. If not, we're going to go get some coffee. Yeah.
How is the investigation still going? I know you've been doing this for years. We've got a bunch of stuff next door with different records and things. But how is it?
Those of us working with, and there are a few folks, and as you might know, Rabbi Rubin is interested in actually creating a museum and actually creating a repository for all of these things. Right now, a few of us have collected some stuff and we're holding it carefully close by until we find a place. There's a couple of issues involving it. One, over time, people just didn't bother there was no central repository, so secretaries would keep their own records, and I have several minute books, but with huge gaps. And so as we find this stuff, the first step is going to be to create a central safe place where we can keep the stuff. And then the second part is to find a way to display it in a manner that will be beneficial to the history of it. And I know Saul greatly wants to support that effort. But right now we don't have anything. Yes? I'm sorry. Mhm. Yeah. Traditionally, a lot of synagogues are designed as upside-down ships. An ark, actually. But this area if you're not familiar with Brunswick in the 19th century, this was a shipbuilding area. And so this probably did make use of a lot of shipbuilding techniques in here. And given the storms we've had, we could have used that last year. But yeah, one of the things I didn't point out that I really meant to was that the cooperation in Brunswick was so that we got actually over 1,000 board feet of lumber donated by Christians in this area. There was a huge effort to get this thing built. It was going on at the same time the First Baptist Church was being built. And so there's a lot of newspaper articles talking about how both of them are coming to bear. So Brunswick's cooperation in this effort here was quite substantial and really quite amazing. And the parade was really something else. Anything else? I'm sorry. As far as we know, these are all, the pews are original. Of course, the carpeting is not. The heart of pine flooring here is actually, it's prettier without the carpet, but the carpeting is nice because it saves the floor. But this is the old narrow grain longleaf yellow pine that was cut almost to extinction by the early 1900s. It takes 50 years to grow one of these trees, and so it doesn't have any commercial value anymore. Now they grow it in 20 and harvest it. But the benches, to my knowledge, are all original. That's right. It is. That's really cool. Back here? Yeah. I'm sorry?
When did they put electricity in the building for all the lighting?
These were originally, and I know when they were working on them, these were originally gas-lit. And so I don't know the date when it was, but it would have been after everything was repaired here following the storms. Yes?
You mentioned that the land was originally bought from the Masons.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear.
The land was bought from the Masons.
Yes.
What was the surrounding blocks? Because the high school wasn't here at the time.
This was a part of a square. Brunswick, if you know, was laid out like Savannah and like a lot of English towns with lots of squares. And I believe it was Queen Square was right here. And this was just an empty lot sitting here owned by the Masons. And the Michelsons owned the property across the way, and so they were instrumental in helping us get that.
Is this the original site for Glen Academy?
No, the original site, well, the original Glen Academy building is what's there now. It was 1840. The original one's not there anymore, but the oldest one is the 1840 building. It used to sit in this lot here on the left of us. And then it was moved to Sterling around the turn of the century and used as an African-American school there for a while, and then was brought back here and sits in its present location. But it was also not only part of Glen Academy, it was also used as a civic building for a while. And there should be a bullet hole in there because there was a fight broke out during one heated political contest. Yes?
What kind of storm and fire protection are attached to this building?
We are discussing that greatly right now. We have some, but we're not sure it's sufficient. One of the main reasons is that this building, as old as it is and made of the material it is extremely dry. And even though one of our members is a retired fire chief, he says we really probably ought to do something more if we possibly can, because it is an extreme, and fire is the big thing we're worried most about. Of all the security, fire is the one that worries us the most. Yes. Well, I can't hear. Oh, yeah, that, I've requested permission. I've been talking about it with a few people, and I've requested permission to talk to the board about exploring that possibility. There's two possibilities. One, we know that there should be stuff in a time capsule or in the cornerstone. Now, during that period, it was done two different ways. One way was it was put actually in the cornerstone itself. And depending on what was put in it, it was either put in there to be found when the building was torn down or to later be opened as a time capsule. Typically, it was done in a tin box that was then soldered all the way around. From the materials in here, we kind of think this one may have actually have intended to open it at some point, but it was not specified. I'd kind of like to do, actually, well, let me back up a little bit. One of the experts over on Jekyll Island has, I've been talking about it, and he has it's a device, I call it a proctoscope, but it has a more official title. He can drill a 3/8-inch hole from the underside of the building on the inside and put the little scope in there and check to see if indeed it's in the cornerstone. If it is, then the second part of the puzzle is then to figure out, do we want to open it? And if so, how do we want to get it out? And so there's all kinds of preservation things we want to consider doing that. The other possibility is it's not there and it's actually buried close by, which the one at Mikveh, Israel was done that way. And so it was recovered. So it's kind of a two-part process. I would kind of like to do a Geraldo Rivera type thing of actually talk about it and hype it up a little bit and invite people in and maybe get a little funds to actually pay for this crazy episode. And I think it would be a very interesting way to bring attention to the synagogue. And if we're right, and there's no reason to believe that it's not somewhere, that it would be quite exciting. I'm a little worried about the photographs and the paper in there, because even in an adequately sealed box, the moisture in this area is so extreme over time that we'd be very lucky to have it completely intact. But with any luck, we might. And we don't have a picture of our first rabbi. We don't even know what our first bylaws were. We're working on those right now, new ones. Yes? I do not think so. I don't have any record that it was. I've got a lot of information on raising funds to restore the temple, but I'm not even sure. It certainly wasn't mentioned in any of the minute books that I have of that, and I have a few from that era. So with any luck, this area, if you're familiar with the topography here, this is a little bit higher up. We're very lucky in that regard. From a flood point of view, it may have gotten wet here, but the major damage from the storms in this part of the Brunswick would have been the winds. They were extraordinary. So we won't know until we first find it. So any others? Good. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it.